You're watching News at Prime. Let's get into this discussion now. The parents of former St. John's College pupil, Julio Mordoh, are planning to sue his ex-teacher and the school for an amount of 60 million rand. This follows his death by suicide. A News 24 report saying Teresa Mordoh, this is the mother of Julio, wants compensation for their emotional shock, grief, trauma, and the financial toll. Mordoh's mother, Teresa, and child protection activist Robyn Wolfson, they are with me in studio tonight to talk about this tragic incident. My thanks to you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Can I start with you,
yes.
Teresa? A bit of a background into your son, firstly. What kind of a human being was Julio, and the background to him ultimately choosing to take his own life?
Julio was a very bright and academically gifted child. He had an endless thirst for knowledge and was accepted into an international university to study physics engineering just prior to his passing.
And that never came to be because of what happened. A bit of background into exactly when it is that you discovered this.
So Julio was sexually abused at school from the ages of 9 to around 12, 13. And he suffered in silence for over a decade without knowing really what was the cause of his post-traumatic stress. And that was only discovered and come to the forefront when St. John's actually disclosed that there was a sexual predator. And at that point, his mental health just took a really deep decline.
Yeah.
He was not able to deal with the trauma and the traumatic flashbacks, and felt that his only way out was to take his life by hanging in a medical facility in Randburg, just round the corner.
And I'm terribly sorry for this because it is still hurting. Robyn, let's talk to you. How do we help children? Rather, how do we help parents such as Teresa? And what responsibility does the school take here?
I think that's a very important question because unfortunately we don't have these difficult conversations enough. We don't have them with parents and we don't have them with children. So one of the things which we need to do as a matter of regular routine as schools and as child protection activists is to make sure that children are educated about grooming, that they understand the process of grooming and what it means and how it makes them feel. One of the things which is so tragic about Julio's story is that he felt like he was the only one. And that is the process of grooming that makes you feel alone and isolated and like somehow it's your fault. So we need to be having these conversations and we need to be preparing children so that they can understand what is appropriate behavior from adults and what is inappropriate behavior. From a school's perspective, I think that their duty of care is incredibly important. What they must do is they must make sure that they have a proper safeguarding strategy. They need to watch their recruitment policies. And if there is any report of wrongdoing, and even if it seems like a small thing, they are duty bound to report that to authorities to make sure that there's a proper investigation.
Teresa, but by the time you found out about what was happening, how far gone was this particular issue for Julio? And in particular, why, in your view, do you think that he decided that the only way to resolve this was to take his own life?
So Julio suffered with extensive and complex PTSD, which none of us were really aware of why until October 2021. And when it became known that his nightmares were actually real and this did happen to him, we had 2 or 3 years since we came back to St. John's that he was really anxious, traumatized, and out of his body. He didn't understand why he was feeling so triggered. So it took, he was back for A-levels at St. John's, and in those 2 years he had a very contradictory experience because he was enjoying A-levels, but he would come home covered in goosebumps, unable to understand why he felt so triggered and so anxious. Yeah. So it was a good 2 years, and then after the announcement and the disclosure of sexual abuse accusations by the school, he really just, his mental health declined rapidly, and he, as Robyn said, blamed himself. He blamed himself for not saying anything at the time. He blamed himself for not saving other people. He blamed himself for not being able to speak up. Yeah. And that tragically led him to take his life.
Robyn, the school, the understanding is that they conducted an independent investigation. Do we know what came out of that? What were the findings, and did they make them known to the parents of Julia, for example? So,
as Teresa mentioned, there were actually a number of other victims who came forward and alleged abuse by the same teacher. And as a result of that, what St. John's did was they commissioned an independent review by former Judge Froneman, who looked at what had happened during the time that this teacher had been at St. John's, really investigated whether there had been allegations of abuse, how the school had dealt with it. Yeah. And then what the school did was they released an abridged and redacted version of that report. So the problem with that, unfortunately, is that there is enough information for us to have some concerns about some of the things that happened at the time, but not enough information for us to be able to ascertain the degree of what had actually been reported. And what is quite interesting is that in St. John's responses to particularly the civil case, they've mentioned to a large extent that neither children nor parents had alleged any abuse, which is very significant and important, except when you understand that we're talking about primary school children who have been groomed by somebody who's expert at their job. And so children often don't come forward. They don't say what has happened to them. Yeah. And then if it's happened at school, their parents wouldn't know. What is more significant in this case is that the Froneman report hints at the fact that there had been reports that had been made by staff members.
About this specific teacher? About
the specific teacher. And what the report says is that it had been investigated to the proper extent. I'm not sure what the exact wording was, but that there was a feeling that they had done everything that was necessary at the time. But that certainly raises some alarm bells, because what we know is that schools should not be conducting independent internal investigations when there are potential sexual abuse claims.
How should it be dealt with?
There's actually a really well-specified process that they need to go through, which includes reporting to the police. They need to fill in what's called a Form 22, which reports to the Department of Social Development and gets the right psychological and social work care for those children. And what they also need to do is to report to the South African Council of Educators. And through those experts, they can then go through the process of conducting an investigation to determine the veracity of those claims. And what's really important is that schools need to understand is they're not making an allegation. What they're doing is, if they've got reasonable suspicion, they are calling in the proper authorities to determine whether there is actual abuse or not. And it appears that in this case that did not happen.
Do we know how the school has dealt with the alleged perpetrator?
So the alleged perpetrator left the school quite a number of years back. In fact, fairly soon after Julio was at school, and then went on to teach at 2 other schools in the same province thereafter. So when the allegations of abuse came to light in 2021, he was asked to step down. In fact, I'm not sure, maybe Teresa knows, whether he was suspended or what the process was, but he is no longer in teaching.
Yeah.
However, he had long since left St. John's.
Teresa, I want to come to you next, because what is of importance now is how the school has dealt with this matter. You're clearly not satisfied, which is why you're now suing the school. But interesting, the News 24 article that we have quoted here, they are saying they interviewed the school, and the school appears to say that they do not agree with, quote unquote, your claims on the matter. How would you respond to that?
Well, firstly, I'd respond in terms of saying the claims will be dealt with in an appropriate and competent court.
Yeah.
What is very clear is that there were things that they didn't do, and those things cannot be undone because they weren't done in the first place. And there is a duty for schools to report matters, even in the cases of reasonable suspicion. And there is sufficient indication that they did not report. And tragically for us, Julio was around 9 or 10. And if we had been aware at that point that there was something suspicious that had happened, we could have given him treatment. We could have addressed the concerns.
Yeah.
So the real tragedy of these circumstances are that until we require and request civil action, nothing actually happens. Nothing changes. We have instances internationally where nothing's happened in churches and institutions and schools. The most recent being the resignation, the resignation actually of the Anglican bishop 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And he was forced to resign by survivors of sexual abuse that took place, that they were aware of. Not even that he was a perpetrator. He was just aware of them and did nothing.
Yeah.
And all it takes for evil to prevail is for good men and women to do nothing.
And I suppose this is what you are trying to force this institution to do, and it is to account. St. John's is a prestigious school. It gets top results every now and then. Do you think that how they've dealt with this was in part in their way to preserve the image of the institution and perhaps less with your suffering and heartache?
I think that would be highly accurate. I would say that their initial response, or lack thereof, was really in favor of protecting the reputation of an elite school, and with very little regard to the survivors of the abuse. And that isn't just my son, Julio. There are several other survivors who have come forward in the case, and they deserve to be heard as well. And this is a question of civil accountability.
Yeah.
This is a question of making sure that our society holds reputational elites or not to account. Nobody is above the law, and this is the law that needs to actually be addressed in order to get civil accountability.
Robyn, as we say, this is an institution which is probably more worried about the image of the institution. But this is happening now, and it has been reported on, as we say, in platforms such as News 24. How do you think they are going to react after this interview for example, is this what ultimately is going to force them to take accountability? Because, as you say, I would be enraged as a parent if an investigation is conducted, which, by the way, is not how they should have done this thing in the first place. But then the results of that investigation, when they are released, it's a redacted version. What are these things that are being hidden away? What is going to force them to account, ultimately, in your view?
So I think that is the purpose behind the civil trial, because unfortunately Julio can't have a voice in a criminal case because he's no longer with us, so he can't testify. So the idea behind the civil trial is to be able to give Julio a voice. But I'm a big believer in terms of institutions, and particularly in schools, that those who've got nothing to hide, hide nothing. And it's incredibly important for schools to be transparent about issues. It is much better for them to admit when things have gone wrong. And truthfully, things do go wrong in schools. But how we deal with them is absolutely critical, because we have to put the best interests of children above absolutely everything else. And I think no matter how prestigious and elite a school is, and I happen to be a parent myself, my choices are made around often how schools will react when things do go wrong. And I'm hoping that St. John's will come forward and they will be transparent and they will admit if they have made mistakes, and they will endeavor, and they certainly have publicly said that they will endeavor to do better in future in terms of safeguarding. And that is something which we want all schools to do, to make sure that they take this issue seriously, and that if there are any allegations of abuse from children or elsewhere, that they react immediately to stop the harm and to make sure those children are safe.
Teresa, if I could just give you the last word. This is a way to try and make your son be remembered for something.
Absolutely.
Your message to parents who may not be aware that things are happening to their children, behavioral patterns perhaps that they need to pick up on, what is your final message to unsuspecting parents?
My final message is that children may not feel comfortable coming forward to their parents, as sadly and as tragic as that is, and that they need a voice so that they don't suffer in silence. We've gone to a long extent of registering a non-profit organization in order to try and support the youth and give them direct access through their cell phone to mental health services. And that really is what I'd like to express to parents and to children, is reach out. Reach out for help. It's not too late.
Yeah. I'm terribly sorry for your loss. I can feel your pain exactly where you sit. I feel it. I'm a parent too. And I'm terribly sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for raising your voice about this. Teresa Mordoh, the mother of Julio, and Robyn Wolfson, thank you very much for the teachings here tonight. Thanks indeed for your time. And it is an open platform. If you are in the St. John's leadership, please contact us. We are a public platform. Your voice is also important to us. Please come and respond to what has been said here tonight. And just on my part, apologies, I mentioned the Catholic Church. I said the Catholic Church is the Anglican Church. Yes. That's the correction I want to make before we are sued here. So thank you very much to both of you for your time.